Get ready to sue the world on Who's Trump Suing Today, featuring star attorneys Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell,
I'm going to release the Kraken,
and Alina Habba.
I cried the night that Saturday Night Live hit me.
And now, Liz Dye.
Welcome back to Who's Trump Suing Today, the exciting game show where we spin the wheel to decide the next recipient of a criminal complaint signed by the President of the United States. Previous winners include the New York Times, CNN, the Washington Post, the BBC, Google, Twitter, Facebook, the Pulitzer Prize Board, New York Attorney General Letitia James, and of course, Hillary Clinton.
Let's spin that wheel.
Look at it go. Will it be California Senator Adam Schiff, the Girl Scouts of America, Microsoft, or puppies? No, we have a winner, and it is the Internal Revenue Service. IRS, come on down. Look, we make fun of Donald Trump's nonsense troll suits a lot on this channel, but this one isn't totally crazy. It's not a made-up cause of action. I mean, yes, the lawsuit is completely defective. We'll get to that. But at the center of it is an actual crime committed by a man named Charles Littlejohn. Littlejohn was an IT specialist who worked for the management consulting firm Booz Allen Hamilton, but his real job was at the Internal Revenue Service, better known as the IRS. He was a government contractor tasked with providing technical support to maintain the data pipeline used to store and monitor Americans' tax information. He was also a deeply thoughtful guy who believed it was unfair that wealthy people and politicians didn't have to disclose their tax returns. So he decided to do something about it, and that something was crime. Now, you may think what Littlejohn did was a good thing. You may have devoured all the articles written based on his disclosures. I know I did, but it is highly illegal for government employees to disclose tax returns, and Littlejohn did it at scale. He uploaded more than 400,000 returns of the wealthiest Americans to a private website, and in 2019 and 2020 gave that data to the New York Times and the public interest media outlet ProPublica. ProPublica's reporting concentrated on tax avoidance schemes that enable the ultra-wealthy to functionally zero out their tax liability, and they weren't afraid to name names. The New York Times focused its reporting on Donald Trump, using 15 years of returns stolen by Littlejohn and tax documents provided by Trump's niece, Mary Trump. Times reporters Russ Buettner, Suzanne Craig, Mike McIntyre, Jim Tankersley, and David Leonard published a series of devastating articles that depicted Trump as a serial fabulist who spent decades ruining one business after another, only to be saved from catastrophe by his father, or The Apprentice, or dubious tax write-offs. Trump is currently suing the New York Times over many of those same articles. The reports by ProPublica and the Times were deeply embarrassing for the rich people targeted, but there's a reason that this kind of leak doesn't happen that often, and that's because it's virtually certain that the leaker will get caught. The IRS's internal systems log every keystroke and record who accessed which documents. So Charles Littlejohn knew when he gave those tax returns to reporters that the government was going to come after him, and it did. In November of 2021, two agents from the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, better known as TIGTA, showed up at Littlejohn's door. He said he wasn't going to talk without his lawyer present, and at first, he asserted his Fifth Amendment right not to incriminate himself. But in July of 2023, agents executed a search warrant for Littlejohn's home, after which he decided to begin cooperating with prosecutors. He told them everything he'd done and agreed to plead guilty to one felony count of disclosure of taxpayer information in violation of 26 U.S.C. Section 7213. The criminal information filed on September 29, 2023, stated that Littlejohn stole tax returns and return information associated with Public Official A and thousands of the nation's wealthiest people, and disclosed the tax information associated with Public Official A to News Organization 1 and the other tax information to News Organization 2. From that point forward, it was public knowledge that Public Official A was Donald Trump and the news organizations were the New York Times and ProPublica. At the sentencing hearing on January 29, 2024, Judge Ana Reyes was clearly troubled by the fact that Littlejohn faced only one felony count for what she called the biggest heist in IRS history. She wanted to know why the Justice Department hadn't charged him for multiple counts under Section 7213 or for theft of government property. And the answer is that if you plead out, you trade your right to go to trial and maybe get acquitted for the certainty of a lower charge. And the inverse is also true. If you make prosecutors take you to trial and prove their case, they're going to throw the book at you, which is functionally a penalty for exercising your constitutional right to go to trial, something that every lawyer understands. But that is why the prosecutor, Jonathan Jacobson, was kind of squirrely when Judge Reyes asked him a whole bunch of questions about why there was just the one charge. Basically, she said, you guys are asking me to send this guy to jail for 5 years, the statutory maximum, while simultaneously saying you only charged him with the one count because he was so cooperative, and that math doesn't work. But in the end, she did sentence Little John to 5 years in prison, far above the standard 10 months, in light of the thousands of tax returns he'd disclosed. For anyone who worries about the IRS or someone else going after them, now is probably a good time to wipe all your personal and private information off the internet. Your cell phone number, home address, email address, private social media accounts, and tons of sensitive data are shockingly easy to purchase by anybody online. But malicious actors cannot hurt you if they can't find you, and so you can fight back and take control of your private information by signing up for today's sponsor, Incogni. Incogni removes your personal data by searching the internet, reaching out to data brokers and websites directly on your behalf, and forcing them to remove your private info. If they resist, Incogni will take care of that too, because Incogni fights back. But what makes Incogni truly powerful in taking back control of your privacy is the custom removals feature. It allows you to flag an unlimited number of sites where your data is exposed, and you can even have Incogni's privacy experts review and tackle the most uncooperative data brokers and people search sites. I've been using Incogni for a while now, and in that time, you can see I've been on hundreds of lists, some of which had a high sensitivity score, meaning the broker had tons of data on me. Luckily, Incogni has completed hundreds of takedowns for me. I could never do this myself, so thank you to Incogni for weeks of work and adding me to over 40 suppression lists. And Incogni will continue to conduct ongoing removals because even if the broker removes your data once, they can collect it and publish it again. So if online privacy is important to you, give Incogni a try. If you scan the code on the screen or click in the link in the description, you will get 60% off their annual unlimited plan, or try Incogni risk-free for 30 days. If you decide you want to keep it, you'll still get the 60% discount so long as you use our code LegalEagle, one word. So sign up for Incogni or we will see you in court. After Little John's conviction came the lawsuits, or not. In general, you cannot sue the government. It's called the doctrine of sovereign immunity, and it's left over from ye olde England and the time of kings. TLDR, the king or the government has to specifically give you permission to sue it. It's called a waiver of sovereign immunity. But in this case, it did. Twice, actually. Both 26 U.S. Code Section 731 and 5 U.S. Code Section 552A, better known as the Privacy Act, authorize civil suits for the wrongful disclosure of taxpayer information. Here, Little John disclosed hundreds of thousands of returns, potentially exposing the government to major liability. And yet, very few of those victims were interested in suing to vindicate their rights. Now, we don't know why they chose not to sue, but we can speculate that those rich people who'd been the subject of unflattering articles on all the grubby things they did to avoid paying taxes weren't so eager to dredge it all up again. I mean, demanding taxpayer money because you were harmed by a leak that showed how little you pay in taxes is kind of a bad look. In the event, only 2 billionaires sued, and one of them, the energy baron Kelsey Warren, didn't even sue the IRS. He sued Booz Allen in federal court in Maryland for invasion of privacy and failing to supervise Little John. That case is still ongoing, but Ken Griffin, the hedge fund billionaire and CEO of Citadel Securities, sued the IRS in December of 2023. He pointed to years of warnings from TIGTA that said the agency's security protocols were insufficient to protect taxpayer data. Griffin filed under Section 7431 and the Privacy Act, demanding $1,000 damages for each unauthorized disclosure of his tax return information as per the statute, and a judicial order forcing the IRS to formulate, adopt, and implement a data security plan that satisfies the requirements of the Privacy Act. Later, he dropped his demand for cash and just asked for a change in IRS policy, and the government fought back. The DOJ insisted that Little John was not a government employee and said Griffin should have to sue Booz Allen instead. They said Griffin failed to allege actual damages other than having people know your personal business, which is unpleasant, but it's not a monetary harm. It's not like Griffin was saying, since my tax returns got leaked, no one will do business with me and my share price tanked. The government also pointed out that the Privacy Act allows taxpayers to sue for monetary damages, but not regulatory reform. So asking a court to rewrite IRS policy was probably off the table. Griffin's suit was filed in federal court in Florida and assigned to Judge Robert Scola. In April of 2024, that judge ruled that Griffin had failed to allege any actual damages under the Privacy Act, so he dismissed count 2. But the issue of whether Little John was actually an IRS employee was a live question, and so count 1 under Section 7431 survived. The case wobbled on until June of 2024 when the parties settled for $0 and a public apology by the IRS. The agency promised to make substantial investments in its data security to strengthen its safeguarding of taxpayer information and to work with TIGTA, the Government Accountability Office, other government agencies, and independent third parties to assess the IRS systems for potential vulnerabilities. And that brings us to January 29, 2026, when the president, his company, and his two eldest sons filed this lawsuit against the IRS and the Treasury. They alleged violations of Section 7431 and the Privacy Act and demanded $10 billion to make them whole for the release of their tax returns. Trump is represented by Alejandro Brito, libel slander lawyer extraordinaire, and as someone who reads all of Trump's lawsuits for a living, I will say that it's less ridiculous than Brito's usual output and lots less inflammatory. For instance, a federal judge in Florida just struck Trump's most recent lawsuit against the New York Times for being decidedly improper and impermissible, and scolded Brito for filing a complaint that stands unmistakably and inexcusably athwart the requirements of the federal rules of civil procedure. If not lawsuit, why lawsuit shaped? Trump's IRS suit is less worse than that, presumably because Brito could copy off the pleading filed by Griffin's extremely good lawyers at the law firm Quinn Emanuel. Brito also had the benefit of being able to cite Little John's deposition, which was taken by those very competent lawyers back in 2024, and that allowed Brito to get specific about the lack of technical safeguards and managerial supervision to prevent contractors from exfiltrating taxpayer data. And unlike Griffin's lawyers, Brito had all the documents from Little John's criminal case, so he had a lot going for him, and still he managed to find plenty of ways to be so weird. Like, remember I said that Judge Scola dismissed Griffin's Privacy Act claim for failure to state actual damages? Trump mostly yada, yada, yada over that part too, saying stuff like, defendants have caused plaintiffs reputational and financial harm, public embarrassment, unfairly tarnished their business reputations, portrayed them in a false light, and negatively affected President Trump and the other plaintiffs' public standing. Again, that is not a claim that you were economically harmed. The only evidence of harm Trump/Brito can point to are articles about Trump in the New York Times, which wrongly and specifically alleged various improprieties related to plaintiffs' financial records and taxpayer history. The claim here is that reporters took Trump's true returns and wrote false stories about him, and that's all the IRS's fault, which is, I mean, it's a bold strategy, Cotton. Also, Trump claims he was damaged because the disclosure forced him to defend against a meritless civil suit brought by the New York Attorney General based on wrongful interpretation of unauthorized disclosures of his confidential tax returns and related tax information. And there's no court in the land that's going to award damages on a theory of, you leaked my federal tax returns and that allowed a state prosecutor to charge me with fraud. Brito also has a bizarre calculation of damages based on page views. Here's that part of the complaint. He says, the unlawful disclosure of each confidential tax return and or return information for each year and to each outlet and each time that confidential tax return and or return information was viewed as a result of the unlawful disclosure constitutes a separate violation of 26 U.S.C. section 6103. And then he says, this information was likely seen by tens of millions of viewers and thus Trump is entitled to billions of dollars in damages. And okay, come with me into this statute. We'll see if we can spot the slippage. Section A1 says, if any officer or employee of the United States discloses any return or return information with respect to a taxpayer in violation of Section 6103, the taxpayer may bring a civil action for damages against the United States in federal court. And then it says the victim is entitled to the greater of $1,000 per disclosure or the actual damages sustained by the plaintiff. The $1,000 is what we call presumed damages. That is, you don't have to prove that you were harmed, you just have to prove the disclosure. But if you can prove that you were harmed, you can recover your actual damages. So assuming that Little John really was an employee of the federal government, then the government is on the hook for at least $1,000 for every return he personally disclosed, which is not nothing. We're talking about 15 years of returns for several entities with supporting tax documents and schedules, and Little John made those disclosures to multiple reporters. That could easily add up to hundreds of thousands of dollars in compensatory damages. But now look at Section A2. If any person who is not an officer or employee of the United States discloses any return, the taxpayer may bring a civil action for damages against such person in federal court. So if the person disclosing that tax return is not a government employee, then the government isn't liable. So it doesn't matter how many times people clicked on the Times stories about Trump's tax returns because the reporters are not government employees. And see where Brito stuck in a bunch of citations to make it look like there's case law to back up this theory of liability? Those cases are all about mouthy IRS agents going around and telling a bunch of people that some guy is under investigation. And Courts all say, yeah, the government's on the hook for $1,000 for every single person the agent blabbed to, but there's nothing about the government being liable for every subsequent revelation. No court says that the government owes money because someone who talked to Agent Blabbermouth posts about it on social media or puts it in the group chat. And look, we've done many videos on Trump's garbage lawsuits. Everyone knows by now that he demands a massive, crazy amount of money as a way of ginning up publicity and goosing the news cycle. But just to run this thing all the way to the ground, part of Trump's $10 billion demand includes punitive damages, which is money awarded to the plaintiff to punish the defendant for egregious bad behavior. But punitive damages are usually pegged to the compensatory damage award. The ratio is like 4 or 5 to 1, although sometimes courts will allow it to go as high as 10 to 1. Let's do a little cocktail napkin math. Pick a number. Say Little John disclosed 1,000 Trump tax documents at $1,000 a pop, and maybe he leaked them to 8 reporters. That's $8 million in compensatory damages. You could multiply that by 10 or even 100 for the punitive damage award and not get anywhere near $1 billion, much less $10 billion. And to be fair, Trump could try to prove that he was actually harmed economically by the disclosure of his tax returns, but I think his own prior statements might make that a little difficult. He spent at least 6 years promising to release his tax returns like every other presidential candidate in history, and claiming that he was economically harmed would, of course, force him to open up his finances and produce evidence, something he has never done once in all the lawsuits he filed. But look, leave aside the damages for a minute and forget how gross and unseemly it is for the president to rock up to an institution he controls and demand $10 billion of taxpayer money. The statutory basis for this lawsuit is not crazy. It's certainly no crazier than Ken Griffin's suit. If Trump had filed it in timely fashion, he might well have been able to collect $1,000 per leaked tax document, but he didn't. Both statutes Trump is suing under have a 2-year statute of limitations. That means that the person whose tax returns were disclosed has 2 years from the date he discovers the leak to file a lawsuit. The first stories about Trump's tax returns appeared in the New York Times in September of 2020, which is certainly more than 2 years ago. But okay, he didn't know immediately that this was an IRS leak. It could have been a hack or a leak by his accountants. In the complaint, Brito says that President Trump did not discover the numerous violations of Section 6103 that were committed in connection with his personal tax returns until January 29, 2024, when the IRS sent a letter informing him that Little John had been sentenced. Oh, really? Well, as it happens, Brito's client posts 100 times a day to social media, so we have all got a front row seat to his every passing thought. And on November 23rd, 2023, Trump posted a link to an article about Little John entitled "Leaker of Trump Tax Documents Worked for Biden Beltway Donor That Just Won a Big New IRS Contract." So good luck with that claim that he didn't find out about it until January. But actually, we can date Trump's knowledge of Little John's disclosures earlier than that. Roll tape. Just kidding, there is no tape. It's illegal to record district court proceedings, but there is a transcript. This is from Little John's plea hearing on October 12th, 2023. And look who's there, Alina Habba for Donald J. Trump. We have met Habba before on this channel. She used to be the one who signed her name to the abusive lawsuits before Trump moved to Florida and hired Brito. Judge Reyes asked if anyone in the courtroom would like to be heard pursuant to the Crime Victims' Rights Act, and Habba said she was here on behalf of President Trump, who was the victim of this atrocity. She called it an egregious breach by an agent of the IRS who targeted the President of the United States, among others, for political purposes and personal gain. She went on to suggest that this was a conspiracy involving Booz Allen Hamilton, a known government-contracted agency which hires CIA assets, and most notably Edward Snowden. Habba requested that the court reject the plea deal or at least give Little John the maximum sentence allowed by law. Again, that hearing was on October 12th of 2023. Even if Trump only learned about the theft of his tax returns that day, the statute of limitations on this lawsuit would have expired in October of 2025. He filed it on January 29th, 2026. And speaking of calendars, note that this leak occurred between 2019 and 2020. If the IRS had failed to supervise Little John and allowed him to steal taxpayer records, then the person in charge of the entire federal government is the one who is ultimately responsible. The buck stops, don't be silly, it never stops there. But if this were a real court case, obviously that would be an issue. As of this recording, we don't know how the IRS is going to respond. I mean, functionally, this is a question of how Trump intends to respond to himself since he once again controls the IRS and the Justice Department. When Ken Griffin sued lawyers for the government, mounted a robust defense. Will the DOJ come forward this time and point out that the statute of limitations has long since expired on Trump's claims and his damages calculation is insane? Trump certainly doesn't seem to think that's what's about to happen, and
You're suing the IRS. Can you talk a little bit about what it's like to be on both sides of a lawsuit?
It's very interesting. I have another one where I've virtually won the Mar-a-Lago break-in suit, and I have to work out some kind of a settlement. I'm supposed to work out a settlement with myself.
okay, no, Trump did not virtually win a lawsuit involving a break-in at Mar-a-Lago. We made a whole video about that. There was no lawsuit. What happened is that Trump filed an administrative complaint that was defective in about 50 different ways, just like this lawsuit, and then announced that the Justice Department had agreed to settle with him for $230 million. That is clearly what he intends to do here, although he's complicated matters by dragging a federal judge into it. Judge Kathleen Williams, who was appointed by Barack Obama, may have qualms about approving a settlement involving billions of dollars of taxpayer money for a claim which is defective on its face. There's also the minor issue of the Constitution's Emoluments Clause, which says that the president shall receive for his services a compensation which shall neither be increased nor diminished during the period for which he shall have been elected, and he shall not receive within that period any other emolument from the United States. That would appear to bar the president from getting paid more than his salary from the federal government. During Trump's first term, lots of people filed lawsuits alleging that he violated the Emoluments Clause by getting paid to run a hotel in D.C.'s old post office building, which is owned by the federal government. Trump also found hundreds of ways to cash in on the job, particularly by staying in his own hotels every weekend and charging the Secret Service for rooms. Those cases failed, mostly thanks to the Supreme Court, which ruled that basically no one had standing to sue in court to enforce the Emoluments Clause. I do wonder, though, whether Judge Williams might balk at signing off on a settlement between Trump and the IRS, which appears to be patently unconstitutional. Asked about the conflict during a Senate hearing, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who is also the acting director of the IRS, said that there was no conflict of interest at all because actually the Justice Department is the one in charge. He's just the guy signing the check.
I'll follow the law, and I'm not involved with any of this. It stems from justice.
So even though the Treasury Judgment Fund is called the Treasury Judgment Fund, you have no control over the Treasury Judgment Fund.
We act as paymaster.
So you will sign it then?
Sorry?
You will sign the check then? If you're a paymaster, you'd be the person's signature is to the Treasury Judgment Fund?
I would assume it would be a wire transfer.
But I don't want to end this video without acknowledging that this is about more than the legal merits of this late math and calendar challenged complaint. The leader of our government slashed food stamps and foreign aid. He's telling ordinary Americans that they have to work longer so that the Social Security Trust Fund doesn't go bankrupt. He's fired tens of thousands of civil servants because he says we can't afford them. He's effectively raised taxes on every American with his tariffs. He cut healthcare subsidies. He caused insurance premiums to skyrocket. And now he's going to give himself $10 billion of our money because someone illegally released information Trump himself has been promising to put out for years. This is stunningly corrupt, and every single one of us should be furious.
Now, all this highlights why it's so important to get a great lawyer when you're dealing with your own case. Now, after I started this channel, every week I'd get hundreds of comments and emails from viewers who are dealing with legal problems, and they'd ask, can you help me find a lawyer? How do I know if this attorney is any good? And there's a massive gap in our justice system. It's that people don't know how to find the right lawyer for their specific situation. They're scared, they're overwhelmed, and they end up doing nothing or hiring the first attorney who calls them back. And that really bothered me. So I started to wonder, what if there was a different way? What if we could build a law firm that actually lived up to the values that I talk about on this channel? Transparency, accessibility, and putting clients first instead of chasing billable hours. A firm where you don't need to pay anything up front and your lawyers only get paid if you do to maximize your opportunity for justice. So a few years ago, I decided to fix that problem. I decided to start my own personal injury law firm. And honestly, it wasn't an easy choice. But I realized I was in this unique position. I had this platform, this community, and the experience. Not to get rich, trust me, there are easier ways to make money than starting a law practice. But we did it because access to justice shouldn't be a luxury. Because finding the right legal representation shouldn't feel like playing Russian roulette with your future. And when you work with my firm, you're not just getting a lawyer. You're getting a team that understands that behind every case is a real person with real stakes. If we can't represent you, or you're in a state where we don't practice, we'll take the time to try to match you with an attorney in my personal network of lawyers. A national network of some of the best lawyers in the country who actually specialize in what you're going through, located right where you are, not just whoever happens to be available. So if you're dealing with a personal injury, a car crash, a data breach, sexual harassment, a social security or workers' comp issue, give us a call at the number on screen or click on the link below. Now, I can't represent everyone that watches this channel. I wish I could, but what I can do is make sure that when you need legal help, you have somewhere to turn to that you can trust. So whether it's me handling your case or the incredible attorneys we partnered with, you'll get the same principles of honesty and education that we bring to every video. And if you're dealing with a legal issue and you're not sure where to start, check out the link in the description. Let's have a conversation about how we can help you find not just a lawyer, but the right lawyer for your situation. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is all about, making sure that when life gets complicated, you don't have to face it alone. Which is why when you need a lawyer, you don't just need a legal team, you need the Eagle team.